The call came at 2:47 in the morning, and I remember staring at my phone thinking it had to be a mistake. My sister's name was on the screen, Celeste. She never called this late. She never called at all unless she wanted something. I almost didn't pick up. They found something in Dad's office, she said, before I could even say hello. Her voice was flat, like she'd already decided how she felt about whatever came next. You need to come home. I hadn't been home in 4 months, not since the funeral. Not since I stood in my father's backyard and watched my mother and my sister divide up his life, like they were sorting through a garage sale, deciding what was worth keeping and what could be thrown away. I had driven 6 hours back to Cincinnati that same night, and I told myself I wasn't coming back until I had a reason to. Celeste had just given me one. My name is Marielle, and I am 31 years old, and until 8 months ago I thought I understood my family. I thought I knew what we were. I thought the fights and the distance and the years of strained holiday dinners were just the ordinary cost of being related to people you didn't always like. I didn't know there was something underneath all of it. Something that had been buried long before I was old enough to ask questions. My father passed away in October, pancreatic cancer. He was 63 years old and he went fast. They always say that like it's a mercy, and maybe it is, but fast also means you don't get to say everything you meant to say. I flew home to Memphis the week they found it, and I stayed for 3 weeks, and then my boss called and said he needed me back. And I looked at my mother sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a cup of coffee she'd let go cold, and I made a choice I've had to live with since. I left. My sister Celeste stayed. She's 3 years older than me, and she's always been the one who stayed. I was the one who went to college out of state, who took the job in another city, who came back for Christmas and summers and called every Sunday out of obligation more than love. Celeste was the one who knew every neighbor's name, who drove my father to his appointments, who organized the medications on the kitchen counter, in those little plastic boxes divided by day. I told myself she was better at it than I was. I told myself she wanted to be there. I told myself a lot of things. The morning after Celeste's call, I packed a bag and drove back to Memphis. The house looked exactly the same, which felt wrong. Brown shutters. The azaleas my father planted the year I was born, still growing too wide along the front walk. My mother's car in the driveway, and parked behind it, a car I didn't recognize. Dark blue, Tennessee plates. My mother answered the door before I could knock. She looked smaller than I remembered, which I know doesn't make sense for 4 months. But grief does something to people's posture. She hugged me with one arm, distracted, already turning back toward the hallway. Celeste is in the office, she said. She's been in there since last night. I asked what was going on. Mother pressed her lips together. Your sister found something. My father's home office was a room I had avoided my whole life, not for any dramatic reason, just because it was his space and he was private about it. A desk, filing cabinets, bookshelves with titles no one else would ever want to read. Tax law. Property management. One entire shelf of binders, color-coded, labeled in his handwriting. Celeste was sitting in his chair when I came in. She looked like she hadn't slept. There was a document on the desk in front of her, several pages, held together with a binder clip, and she was holding a coffee mug with both hands like she needed something to grip. Close the door, she said. I closed it. She pushed the pages across the desk toward me. I found that in the bottom drawer. Behind the hanging files. I picked it up. The paper was heavy, cream-colored, the kind of paper that costs more than regular paper and is meant to signal that whatever's on it matters. At the top, in clean black font, Amendment to Last Will and Testament of Charles David Whitmore. My father's name. I sat down in the chair across from her and started reading. My father had a business. Most people knew that. He ran a property management company for 30 years, started it himself when I was still in diapers, built it up slowly and carefully the way he did everything. What I hadn't known, what I don't think I ever thought to ask about, was that the company was worth considerably more than anyone had told me. The original will, filed 5 years ago, left the business to be divided equally between my mother, Celeste, and me. A third each. This amendment, dated 14 months before his death, changed that. It left my third to me directly, in a separate trust, with specific language about how it couldn't be dissolved or transferred without my signature and consent. It also appointed an outside attorney as executor, not the family lawyer. Someone I'd never heard of. I read it twice, then I looked up at Celeste. Why would he hide this? I asked. She wrapped her hands tighter around the mug. I've been asking myself that all night. What I didn't say, and what I think we were both thinking. Why had the family attorney, the man, who had handled my father's legal work for 20 years, who stood at the funeral and shook everyone's hands, Why had he never mentioned this document existed? I called the number on the amendment that afternoon from my car, parked in front of the house. The attorney's name was Mr. Burkett. He answered on the second ring, and when I said my name, he went very quiet for a moment before he said, "I've been waiting for you to call." He told me to come to his office the next morning. He said he couldn't explain everything over the phone. I asked him why, and he said, "Because some of what I have to tell you needs to be said in person, and because you're going to want to sit down." I barely slept that night. I lay in my childhood bedroom staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle the way old houses do. All those small creaks and sighs that used to feel familiar, and now felt like the house was trying to say something I couldn't translate. Celeste knocked on my door around midnight. She came in without waiting, which she's done her whole life, and sat on the edge of the bed. "Did you know he was worried about money?" she asked. I shook my head. "He asked me about 6 months before he got sick if I thought you were doing okay, financially." She looked at the floor. I didn't know what he meant at the time. I didn't either. I was doing fine. I had a good job. I paid my bills. I wasn't wealthy, but I wasn't struggling. I couldn't figure out why my father would have been asking. "I think he knew something we didn't," Celeste said. I thought about the amendment, about the separate trust, about the fact that he'd had it drawn up by a different attorney quietly without telling anyone. "Yeah," I said. "I think you're right." Mr. Burkett's office was in a part of Memphis I didn't know well, a quieter street with old buildings that had been renovated but not overdone. He was older than I expected, maybe 70, with the kind of stillness that some people develop after spending decades watching families fall apart over paperwork. He had a file folder on his desk when I sat down. He pushed a glass of water toward me and folded his hands. "Your father came to me about 14 months before he died," he said. "He'd been my client years ago, before he switched to your family's regular attorney. He came back because he trusted me, and because he didn't want anyone else to know what he was doing. He told me to go ahead and ask what I needed to ask." I asked why my father had changed his will without telling anyone. Mr. Burkett was quiet for a moment. "Because he had concerns about how his estate would be handled after he was gone. Specifically, he had concerns about whether you would receive what he intended for you to receive." I stared at him. "What does that mean?" He opened the folder. He slid a single page across the desk. A letter. Handwritten, my father's handwriting, unmistakable. I had grown up reading that handwriting on birthday cards and grocery lists and notes left on the kitchen counter. I read it with my hands flat on the table so they wouldn't shake. My father wrote that he had noticed, over several years, a pattern. Money from the business had been directed into accounts he didn't fully control. Accounts that had been set up during a period when he'd given Celeste's husband authority over certain financial operations. His son-in-law, a man named Todd, who had worked in the business for 6 years, who my father had trusted and trained and treated like a second son. My father wrote that he wasn't certain. He wrote that he hoped he was wrong. But he wrote that he wanted to make sure, whatever happened, that my share was protected separately so that no one could get to it without his knowledge, and after he was gone, without mine. He wrote, "Marielle is the one they would overlook. I want to make sure she is the one who cannot be overlooked." I put the letter down on the desk and looked at the window for a long time. Mr. Burkett waited. "Did he know he was sick when he wrote this?" I asked. "No," he said. "He found out about the cancer 3 months later." I didn't go back to the house right away. I sat in my car in the parking lot outside Mr. Burkett's office for almost an hour. I watched a woman walk past with a stroller and a coffee cup. I watched a delivery truck idle at the corner. I watched the light change. My brother-in-law Todd. I'd always found him hard to read. Polished, charming in a careful way, the kind of person who remembers small details about people. Your favorite restaurant, how you take your coffee, in a way that should feel warm, but somehow always felt like information being filed away for later. He had started working in my father's company as a project coordinator, and within 3 years was managing accounts that handled tens of thousands of dollars a month. My father had promoted him, my father had trusted him, and apparently, quietly, privately, my father had started to wonder. I called my college roommate Eva, not because she had any legal expertise, but because she was the only person I knew outside the situation who I could tell and trust. I sat in the parking lot and told her everything, and she listened without interrupting, and when I was done she said, "Marielle, you need a lawyer." "I have a lawyer," I said. "That's the man I just met with." "No," she said. "You need your own lawyer, one who isn't connected to your dad." She was right. I knew she was right, but I also knew that the moment I did that, the moment I took any formal action, everything would change. My mother would find out, Celeste would find out, Todd would find out, and I didn't know yet who knew what. That evening, I told Celeste I'd met with Mr. Burkett. I watched her face carefully when I said it. She was standing at the kitchen counter, cutting an apple into slices, and she stopped but didn't turn around right away. And, she said, he had a letter from Dad. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. She put the knife down. She turned around. Did you know about the account transfers? I asked. The look on her face answered before she did. Not guilt, something more complicated than guilt. Confusion, and underneath it, something that looked like the beginning of a very bad realization. What transfers? She said. It wasn't a question. We sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours. Celeste pulled up everything she had access to on her laptop. She had handled most of the business paperwork during my father's illness, because Todd had said he was too overwhelmed with the operational side. The more she looked, the more she found. Or rather, the more she found missing. Invoices paid to vendors she didn't recognize. Transfers to a holding company registered in Delaware that she'd never heard of. A line of credit opened 18 months ago that she hadn't known existed. By 10 o'clock she had her phone to her ear, calling her husband. He didn't pick up. What followed was 2 weeks I would not wish on anyone. A forensic accountant Mr. Burkett recommended. A woman named Dr. Solis, brisk and methodical and deeply unimpressed by anyone's feelings, went through the business records going back 4 years. What she found was not one large theft, the kind that shows up clearly like a wound. It was a series of small redirections, a percentage here, a reclassification there. Money moved in ways that were technically legal on the surface but deliberately obscured, designed to look like normal business expenses if no one looked too closely. Todd had been methodical. He had started small early on, probably testing what he could get away with. Over 4 years the amounts had grown. Dr. Solis estimated that between $280,000 and $340,000 had been moved in ways that could not be accounted for by normal business operations. My father's company was still profitable, but it was significantly less valuable than it should have been. I hired my own attorney. Her name was Ms. Chandler and she was 45 and direct in a way I found studying. She told me exactly what we could do, what we probably could do, and what we likely could not do, and she didn't soften any of it. She told me we had grounds for a civil suit against Todd for breach of fiduciary duty and conversion. She told me we should also be talking to the district attorney's office, because what had been done was not just a civil matter. She also told me, gently, that Celeste would need to make her own decisions about how to proceed. As Todd's wife, she had a complicated position. She could cooperate, which would help our case considerably, or she could choose not to. I hadn't thought about what any of this meant for Celeste. I'd been so focused on what Todd had done that I hadn't fully reckoned with the fact that Celeste had married him. That Celeste had a daughter with him. That whatever happened next, Celeste's life was going to be detonated right alongside mine. I drove to her house. She met me at the door before I knocked. We sat on the back porch because neither of us could be inside, and she cried for a while without saying anything, and I sat next to her and let her. Eventually she said, I didn't know. I want you to know that I didn't know. I know, I said. He used me too, she said. He put papers in front of me during Dad's illness, and I signed them without reading, because everything was chaos, and I trusted him, and he used that. She looked at the backyard, a swing set her daughter had outgrown, a garden her mother had given her starts from hostas and coneflowers. The ordinary evidence of a life that had just been cracked open. I'll cooperate, she said, with whatever you need. My mother had to be told. That conversation was the hardest one. We sat at the kitchen table. The same table where we'd eaten every Thanksgiving, where my father had helped me with homework, where my mother had cried the morning after he died, and I told her as clearly and calmly as I could. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, your father suspected. He didn't tell me, because he didn't want me to worry when he was sick. He was protecting me. She folded her hands on the table. She looked so much like my father in that moment. That quality he'd always had of going very still when something was serious, of getting quieter rather than louder. He always said Todd was too smooth, she said, almost to herself. He said it once, years ago, and I told him he was being unfair. He never said it again. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. Her knuckles were rough, the way hands get after a lifetime of use. We're going to get it back, she said. Whatever we can. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even really a statement of certainty. It was just my mother deciding out loud in her kitchen at her table. I had forgotten how much I loved her. The months that followed were the kind of slow that feels like deep water. Everything moving, but nothing you could see. Ms. Chandler filed the civil complaint. The DA's office opened an investigation. Todd retained an attorney. Of course he did. And that attorney immediately began disputing everything, characterizing the financial moves as standard business decisions, claiming Todd had authority my father had given him, painting the whole thing as a family dispute over an estate being dressed up as fraud. I had expected that. Miss Chandler had warned me about it. What I hadn't expected was how much it would affect me to go about my life while this was happening. I went back to Cincinnati. I went back to work. I answered emails and sat in meetings and ate lunch at my desk. And underneath all of it, constantly, was the knowledge that somewhere in Memphis a man was trying to rewrite the story of what he'd done to my family. I called my mother every Sunday. Real calls, not out of obligation, not checking a box, calls where we actually talked for an hour. She told me about her garden and her neighbor who was learning to bake bread and a documentary series she'd started watching. Small things. But calling her had become something I needed as much as she did. My aunt, my father's older sister, flew in from Atlanta to help my mother for a few weeks. She's in her late 60s, sharp as anyone I've ever met, and she made it clear within 24 hours that she had her own opinions about Todd that she had been diplomatic enough not to voice while my father was alive. She was less diplomatic now. Your father was too generous, she told me on the phone one evening. It wasn't a weakness, it was a choice he made. But some people see generosity as an opening. She was the one who found something the accountants had missed. Not a financial record. A storage unit. Todd had rented it 3 years ago in a business name that was a variation of my father's company name, close enough to look like it belonged to the company, different enough that it technically didn't. Inside were boxes of documentation, physical files that should have been in the office but had been removed. My aunt had found it because she went looking. She'd known my father her entire life, and she said it didn't add up that certain records were missing, and she'd gone looking the way she went about everything. Methodically, without announcing herself, without asking anyone's permission, she called me when she found it. I flew back to Memphis the next day, standing in that storage unit, in the fluorescent light, looking at what Todd had tried to disappear. I thought about my father writing that letter to Mr. Burkett, about him sitting in his office, in that chair, suspecting something and not being able to prove it and deciding the only thing he could do was protect what he could protect. He had protected my share. He hadn't been able to get to the truth himself, but he'd made sure it would survive him. I stood there in that storage unit and I cried, not sadly, or not only sadly, it was more complicated than that. I cried because I missed him. I cried because he had known, at least partially, what was happening. I cried because he had thought of me, specifically enough to go to a different attorney and have a separate trust drawn up and put a letter in a drawer for someone to eventually find. He had not forgotten me. Even in the middle of everything, he had not overlooked me. It took 11 months from the day I found the amendment to reach a resolution. Todd settled the civil suit rather than go to trial. The amount recovered through the settlement was not everything. It rarely is, but it was substantial, and it was enough to restore my mother's financial security and return meaningful value to the business. The DA's office accepted a plea that carried real consequences: restitution, probation, a record that would follow him. It wasn't everything I'd wanted. There were days when I sat with Miss Chandler in her office and wanted more, wanted the full accounting, wanted a courtroom, wanted a jury to hear every detail. She reminded me, gently and repeatedly, that the goal was resolution, not theater, that getting my mother's future secured was worth more than the satisfaction of a trial. She was right. I knew she was right. Knowing it didn't always make it feel like enough. Celeste filed for divorce. I didn't ask her to, and I wouldn't have. It was her decision, and she made it herself. She called me the night she told Todd it was over, and we talked for 2 hours, and at some point we weren't even talking about him anymore. We were talking about our father, about things we remembered, about the way he used to make pancakes on Saturday mornings, always burned on one side because he'd get distracted reading the paper, and how he'd serve them confidently anyway like it was intentional. We laughed. We hadn't laughed together in so long that it felt strange, like a room you hadn't been in for years that still smelled the same. I wish he'd told me, Celeste said, about what he suspected. I know why he didn't, but I wish he had. Me too, I said. We were both quiet for a minute. He told you, she said. In his way. She meant the amendment, the letter, the trust. Yeah, I said, he did. I moved back to Memphis in the spring. Not because I had to, not because anything required it. I just decided I wanted to be closer. I found a job I liked, a smaller company but good work, and I found an apartment 15 minutes from my mother's house. I go over for dinner on Sundays now. My aunt visits every couple of months from Atlanta. Celeste brings my niece, who is 7 years old and deeply uninterested in anything the adults find important, and watching her run around the backyard while the rest of us sit on the porch with iced tea feels like something new being built on top of something old. My mother is doing better. Not perfect. She misses him every day, and I think she'll miss him every day for the rest of her life, and that's not something that gets fixed. But she's steady. She has her garden and her neighbor and her documentary series, and she has us close by, and she seems to know the difference now between what she lost and what she still has. I think about my father often. I think about him writing that letter and sealing it away, and trusting that someday, someone who loved him would find it. I think about what it means to protect someone quietly, without them knowing, without needing credit for it. I didn't know, for most of my life, how much he was paying attention. I thought I was the one who left, the one who wasn't really present, the one who sent the obligatory Sunday calls and showed up at holidays and kept the relationship at a careful distance. I thought he accepted that. I thought maybe it was fine, but he had been watching. He had known me well enough to put my name on something separate, to say without saying it, this one needs protecting. Not because I was weak. Because he understood how easy it is to overlook the person who isn't standing right in front of you. My father was not a dramatic man. He didn't make speeches or write sentimental letters for ordinary occasions. What he left behind, the amendment, the trust, the letter in the drawer, those were the most like him. Quiet, careful, and completely certain that the people he loved would eventually figure it out. I figured it out. I'm still figuring it out. But I know who I am now in a way I didn't before this year. I know what my family is, the real version, the one with all the damage, and all the loyalty together in the same place. I know what my father thought of me. I know what my sister is capable of when things get hard. I know what my mother looks like when she decides something is going to be okay. I know what it means to be someone's daughter. Not the daughter who stayed. Not the daughter who left. Just his daughter, all the way through, which turns out to have been enough.